On May 31st, 1985, one of the deadliest tornado outbreaks in North American history swept through parts of Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ontario, Canada. 89 people died and more than 1,000 were injured. The damage was estimated at over $600 million. A bombed out battlefield was how one local weather service described the borough of Wheatland in Pennsylvania. An hour north of Wheatland, the tiny community of Albion was among the hardest hit, with 12 residents killed, 80 injured, and a corridor of devastation 2 blocks wide. St. Lawrence's Catholic Church was ripped in half, and the parish priest, Father Robert Riley, escaped being sucked out of the rectory window only by bracing himself against the window frame. The rectory was totally destroyed. Against all odds, a number of homes directly in the path cut by the tornado remained standing, untouched, amid the debris. There was something unusual about these homes, and it wasn't storm-proof windows or heavy-duty framing. What set these houses apart was that in each one, the family had formally enthroned the Sacred Heart and consecrated their homes and family members to him. Thank you, Charles, for inviting me here tonight, and thank you to all of you who have logged in to listen. I'm Madeleine Straczynski, and I have just shared with you an extract from an article printed in the Catholic Herald in 2019, authored by Jane Stannis. My own brief story is that I ceased to be a young adult about 4 years ago, so I guess that makes me an old adult. I'm a journalist, communicator and broadcaster, and I served as communications director for the Diocese between 2020 and 2023. I come here tonight not as a theologian or an expert in the Sacred Heart, but as a layperson, a sinner and a worrier who has always felt an affinity to the Sacred Heart from a very early age. I think my first moments of feeling that devotion to the Sacred Heart is as a young girl, always finding a lot of consolation in that very short prayer, O most Sacred Heart of Jesus, I place all my trust in thee, which my parish priest would say at the end of every Mass. So perhaps that was the start of my devotion without me fully realising it. There is so much to say about the Sacred Heart, but I won't say too much. But Father Stephen Wang summed up a very important point when he said, this is not just a devotion that maybe started in the 15th or 17th century. This is about the heart of God loving us all for eternity, and the heart of God in the human heart of Jesus, loving us from the time of his incarnation until the end of time and beyond. It is about the heart of Christianity, our love for Jesus and his love for us. And he later says it is not a devotion, but the devotion. So before I talk about more about the visions of St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, I'd like to share the story of a woman who was married about 9 years ago and who actually started her married life in the Diocese of Nottingham. Before she got married, she was diagnosed with a tumour on her pituitary gland and told that she was very unlikely to conceive without treatment first. Nevertheless, about 3 months quite after her wedding, she discovered quite miraculously that she was in fact pregnant. Now, she'd always wanted a big family, and she was initially delighted to discover that she was pregnant. But within a few weeks of the pregnancy, she found she couldn't keep food down. She was vomiting so regularly that she couldn't get out of bed. She loved to cook meals for her husband, but even if she opened the fridge, she'd throw up. Everything was making her feel violently sick. And she promptly grew to absolutely hate being pregnant, despite obviously loving this unborn child and really wanting to meet them. Thanks be to God, she delivered a healthy baby boy, and she loved the baby so much that despite how sick pregnancy had made her, she felt determined that her son should have a sibling, and she really prayed to God that he would. And when her son was about 15 months old, she found out she was pregnant again. But what was strange this time around is that she didn't feel anywhere near as unwell as she had in previous pregnancies. On the one hand, she was glad that she didn't feel so unwell, but she was also slightly worried because she'd read that an absence of pregnancy symptoms could sometimes indicate, not always, but sometimes, that all was not well with the baby. And lo and behold, about 10 weeks into that pregnancy, she began to bleed and was referred for an early ultrasound. She lay down on the hospital bed, and she and her husband waited for the sonographer to find a heartbeat. They then heard the devastating news that no heartbeat could be found and the baby had died inside her womb. So she went home and she waited for the inevitable miscarriage to happen. And about a week later, she delivered her tiny baby who had passed away some weeks before. Naturally, she and her husband were devastated, but about 6 months later, she discovered that she was pregnant again. And once again, she felt surprisingly well, and so she felt highly anxious, waiting to see what would happen with this baby. Again, after about 10 weeks, she began to bleed, and it was confirmed that her third child had also died in the womb. So, understandably, she was very depressed and she was preparing herself for the worst case scenarios that she might not have any more children. That was her greatest fear. And she felt so helpless and just completely baffled. And she was asking God, what is your plan for my life? She just could not understand why this was happening. And then she stumbled across a podcast which was hosted by a Catholic couple. And they were hugely devoted to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And they were really encouraging their listeners to consecrate their homes to the Sacred Heart and enthrone Jesus as the king of their home. Just as those families who survived the tornado in the USA did. And something which the host said really stuck with this woman. She said, don't consecrate your home because you want this or you want that. Just do it. Just do it out of total love for the Lord without any expectation of wanting anything. So that's exactly what the mother did. She thought, I don't know why I've lost two babies, but I'm just going to give Jesus my family and my fertility and consecrate my home to the Sacred Heart. And as it happened, her 33rd birthday was coming up soon. So about a month after she lost her last baby, on a beautiful day in September, she threw a big party. And she began this party with a consecration to the Sacred Heart of her home and her family. And so she was utterly amazed when she discovered less than a month later that she was already pregnant again. She'd never conceived so quickly before. But naturally, she was incredibly anxious that she would lose this baby as well, and she totally withdrew from friends and family. She was diagnosed with depression and referred for an early pregnancy scan in order to try and reassure her, or at least to find out, how this baby was doing. So at 8 weeks pregnant, she and her husband returned to that same hospital floor where she'd felt such grief, and she lay down on the bed and she waited and she prepared herself for the sonographer to say yet again, I'm sorry, but we just can't find a heartbeat. But instead, the sonographer said, would you like to know what I can see? And she flipped around the screen, and there, in grainy black and white, was a baby's beating heart. Now, people think, as I once did, that devotion to the Sacred Heart began with St. Margaret Mary Alacoque. But in fact, its foundation can be traced to early Christianity when Scripture repeatedly mentions the love of God. And it's thought that the specific devotion to the Sacred Heart can be traced to the 11th century when Christians would meditate on the 5 wounds of Jesus. St. Gertrude the Great, who had private revelations regarding the Sacred Heart, helped further the understanding of Jesus' Sacred Heart in the late 13th century. But tonight, let's focus on the story behind the relatively modern devotion to the Sacred Heart, which began in the 17th century. It's the story of a nun called Margaret Mary Alacoque, who lived in the French town of Paray-le-Monial. She was a visitation nun who, due to her deep love for the Eucharist, had a number of visions of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and it's these apparitions which inform our devotions to the Sacred Heart today. Famously, Jesus revealed 12 promises to Margaret Mary that he makes to those who devote themselves to the Sacred Heart. And I'm not going to list them all here, but I would like to talk about a few things to conclude, which we've learned about devotion to the Sacred Heart. In the last of the 12 promises that Jesus revealed to Margaret Mary, he said, I promise you, in the excessive mercy of my heart, that my all-powerful love will grant to all those who receive Holy Communion on the first Fridays in 9 consecutive months the grace of final perseverance. They shall not die in my disgrace, nor without receiving their sacraments. My divine heart shall be their safe refuge in this last moment. So first of all, if you do want to be more devoted to the Sacred Heart, you can mark out those first Fridays in your calendar and commit to going to Mass on those days. And as it happens, tomorrow is the first Friday. And I think making, Mass once a month on a first Friday, yes, in theory this sounds easy, but please learn from my mistakes. Do make a note in your diaries, because I know how easy it is that life suddenly takes over and Jesus is sort of pushed out in the busyness of life. So it's good to get organised and really mark out that time. And amongst the other things that he revealed to Margaret Mary, Jesus also encouraged us to attend Eucharistic adoration on a Thursday, which is perfect for you young adults, because I know that you often meet on Thursdays, usually hold a holy hour. So you could attend a first Thursday holy hour and then get to confession if needed, and then the following day it's First Friday, and hopefully you'll be able to make Mass too. And one of the other things that Margaret Mary learned through our Lord is that he wanted an annual feast in honour of his Sacred Heart, and this was instituted in 1856 by Blessed Pope Pius IX. The Solemnity of the Sacred Heart is always celebrated on the Friday after the octave of Corpus Christi, and so this year it falls on June 27th. And you can definitely find a way to make this a day of prayer, dedication, and celebration, because it is, after all, a solemnity, so it's fitting to celebrate. So personally, I plan to pray a litany to the Sacred Heart, go to Mass, and then if the weather's good, we'll probably have a barbecue, as it will be Bacon Friday, thanks to it being a solemnity. I also try and buy my kids and my nephews and nieces jammy Dodgers, because they have this red heart in the middle, and it reminds them that it's a special day in the life of the church, and it sort of makes it liturgically memorable and relevant for those children. But there is one last thing that you can do on that day, which is the most powerful thing that you can do, and you've probably already guessed what that thing is. In his promises to Margaret Mary, Jesus said, "I will bless every home in which an image of my heart is exposed and honoured." And it is from this that we have the tradition of consecrating ourselves and our homes to the Sacred Heart, as that young grieving mother did, and those tornado survivors. Now, I've always taken a lot of comfort in the mantra, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good," because so often everything I do is chaotic. But it's very easy to consecrate yourselves and your homes to the Sacred Heart. It doesn't have to be perfect, just go for it. On the Feast of the Sacred Heart later this month, you can, all you need to do is to pray devoutly a prayer of consecration to the Sacred Heart, and put on your wall an image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. You can keep it very simple, and then it's recommended that you renew that consecration once a year, and again you can do that every time it's the Feast of the Sacred Heart. Finally, to conclude, I still have a story to finish, which I began with. I left you with the joyful image of the mother and father seeing their unborn baby's heartbeat only a few months after consecrating their home to the Sacred Heart. But that was only 8 weeks into the pregnancy, and there was still a long road ahead of them. A few weeks later, the mother had her dating scan. It was just before Christmas, a scan, and it was confirmed their baby would arrive sometime the next year, around June 25th. Obviously, they were delighted, but the woman remained very nervous that something would go wrong. And due to a mix-up with her medical note, she was in fact informed in the later months of her pregnancy that her child wasn't growing, and she was sent for an emergency scan. But during that scan, it was revealed that quite the opposite, that the baby was in fact very big, and the doctors were worried that if she gave birth past her due date, there would be complications due to the size of this very big baby. So, on the advice of the medical team, she agreed to an induction. So that's medical intervention to bring on an early labour. But by this point, she was in a very highly anxious state. She'd been through so much to try and have this other child, and she was desperate to gift her beloved son, who was about to turn 3 years old, a younger sibling. The induction sadly failed. Her baby in the womb was becoming distressed, and their heartbeat was decelerating. So she was whisked to theatre for an emergency C-section. Her son was finally born at 11:30 p.m. on June 19th, 2020, on the Feast of the Sacred Heart. That baby was in fact my baby, and we chose the name Theodore, which means gift from God. Thank you for listening.